Welcome everyone to this overview of teaching and learning and CPD for this academic year. I'm going to start with something that I shared with staff when I started last academic year in terms of really my vision for where professional development should go at Rodborough School, and just to kind of talk to them about talk to teaching staff about the rationale. So I talked to them last year about the fact that, in my view, professional development amongst teachers has two kind of core strands or two areas. The first one in the lilac circle is what I would call the flow pedagogical growth and development. And that in kind of simple terms is all about improving the quality of teaching and learning, the actual practice in the classroom. And it's going to be linked to the trust teaching and learning policy, which is flow. The other strand or other element of professional development is what I would call professional growth and development. And this is really about growing people's careers and their ability to lead others and their ability to coach others or work with others and manage them. So it's about their careers as opposed to their teaching and learning. Now, the two are linked, but they are also seen as quite separate. And I talked to staff about the fact that within each strand or each model, there would be different mechanisms to try and develop those areas. So if we just go back to pedagogical growth and development, i.e. the teaching and learning, there were kind of really four areas or four vehicles in which the teachers can develop their teaching and learning. So if we start from the bottom, if you're a new teacher or you're a trainee, you'll be doing your own program, and that will all be focused on developing you as a teacher. But if you're a more established teacher at Rodborough School, there are three kind of main ways in which you develop your teaching. One is through something called subject pedagogical development sessions, which are basically subject sessions that would be held on a Monday, led by the subject leader, which would be focused on how to improve the teaching of your subject. Alongside that would be WMAT subject architect program. So these would be sessions across the trust once a term where subject teachers from every subject would get together. So all the historians from across the trust, all the geographers from across the trust would get together to share good practice. And then alongside the subject teaching and learning, there would also be more general pedagogy, more general teaching and learning development. And that's what I would call the flow pedagogy development program, or the roots. And that would be your kind of core professional development led by me and led by a teaching and learning team, also happening on a Monday and dovetailing into the SPDS sessions. So that's what would be how we would grow teaching and learning. And then in terms of professional growth and development, I'm not going to talk too much about that because I know Emma's presentation is based on that for Monday. But the main area that I'm responsible for in that at the moment is the leadership forums. And I lead the subject leaders and Hannah leads the pastoral leaders. But those are the main vehicles in which we grow our middle leadership team within the school. So if we think about those as kind of like the way that professional development should be structured at Rodborough, in the autumn term this year, I introduced the new Flow Professional Growth and Development, or CPD program for the year. So this would be about the general pedagogy. And I talked to staff about the fact that we'd have two main focuses for the year emerging from the school development plan. The first one would be a refocus on behaviour, where we started it last year, but really finishing that off and honing that this academic year. And then when we went into the spring term or the summer term, we would then move on to the next strand of teaching and learning, which we need to focus on, which is responsive teaching, or really in a nutshell, we're talking about formative assessment in the lessons. So we'd spend the autumn term really consolidating behaviour and then moving on to responsive teaching in the spring and summer term, but also carrying it on in September 2024 into 2025. So like I said, we'd be focusing on behaviour for learning and Rodborough routines in the autumn term. And I explained to staff, I gave them the rationale in terms of why we're doing this. Well, greater consistency across the school and something that all teachers were craving, greater certainty amongst staff and students good behaviour creates certainty amongst staff and students. And also if you have really good routines in the lessons and good behaviour and very clear rules, it enhances the learning potential in each lesson, which is really what we're all about. Now, to really kind of embed the behavior for learning and really kind of make people appreciate the importance of it, we developed a kind of model for behavior for learning at ROBRA, and we called it the ROBRA Flow Lesson Model. And we talked about procedural routines that really, if we get these right in every lesson, across every lesson, in every subject, across the entire school, the delivery of the subject material would be really enhanced and would be much, much easier. And we broke it down in terms of bits of the lesson. So the first bit would be the beginning of the lesson, followed by the end of the lesson. So these would, we called this a strong start and strong exit, and they would be characterized by an entry routine, followed by a retrieval activity or a DIN, I do it now, activity. And then at the end of the lesson, it'd be a strong exit routine. And the two would kind of go hand in hand, because once you let your class out, you need to get a new class in, and the two would go hand in hand. Now, these routines were introduced last year and even the year before. And so really this term, we're just revisiting them and making sure that we're fully embedding them in school. Now, alongside the beginning and the end of the lesson, we also introduced some routines for the middle bit of the lesson. And really, in the middle bit of the lesson, you have two things that are going on. You've either got the teacher teaching or you've got the students learning. So we introduced some routines for what we call strong deliberate instruction, led by the teacher, or strong deliberate practice. So strong deliberate instruction would be common routines for any transition in the lesson, so where you go from one learning activity to the next, and how do you attract students' attention. We talked about using STAR. This was introduced last year, so we're revisiting it. But also we then talked about making sure that there's a routine for when the teacher models something, explains something, or wants to check for learning, and they need the student's attention. So there would be a routine for that. And then on the flip side of that, when a student is working, we talked about introducing routines for the three main modes of learning in the lesson. So students are either learning independently, learning in pairs or groups, or they're listening to the teacher, in which case they're being instructed. So we made sure that we had routines for each of those modes for learning, and talked to staff about when do you choose one over the other, and how do you set those up to make sure that all students know exactly what to do in each mode of learning. So those were the routines that we either revisited or introduced in the autumn term, and they would be done on a Monday afternoon through CPD. Alongside that, we also introduced a new appraisal model, which was a little bit different to the one that staff were usually used to. But this one had a series of different targets, some that were linked to teaching and learning, some that were linked to career and professional growth. All teaching staff received a first target on teaching and learning, a pedagogical growth development target. And because we're focusing on behaviour in the autumn term, their first target was all about behaviour. And I set the target for all staff because it was all about making sure that the ROBRA lesson routines were embedded in every lesson. Alongside that, staff then were asked to consider a target relating to their own professional growth, so their career. Now, this obviously depended on who you are in the staff body. So if you're a middle leader, head of year, subject leader, or you're a TLR holder, you're going to have a target that's going to be very specific to your role. And if you are not any of those people, you don't have a TLR or don't have a leadership position in the school, we also ask staff to consider, well, where would they like to go in the future, so that we can start having those conversations. Alongside those two targets, so a teaching and learning target and a career target, a professional growth target, the pastoral team also wanted to set everybody a pastoral target. So these were devised by the year leaders with Hannah and Fiona, and they were all centered around good tutoring, focusing on attendance and focusing on behaviour and equipment and so on and so forth. So staff in the autumn term were asked to really kind of consider these three targets as part of their appraisal. And appraisal is directly linked, particularly for teaching and learning, for this for the pedagogy, it's directly linked to the training. And I talked to staff about the fact that the training happens on a Monday, either through me or through your subject SPDSs. The appraisal then is a way of you documenting your development through that you're training. So how has your training enhanced your practice? And before before we did any of this, I talked to staff about why the CPD program on behaviour for learning and the ROBRA lesson routines and responsive teaching was designed in the way it was designed. And I talked to them about the fact that actually it's been based on the best research from the EF, the Education Endowment Foundation, which basically says, and quite rightly says, that good professional development or good continuous professional development in schools has a direct impact on improving pupil outcomes. So if you get that right, pupil outcomes will improve, but it's got to be designed properly so that it does yield those outcomes. And it talks about, the report from the EF talks about making sure that professional development includes a series of mechanisms, and they list 14 mechanisms that make up good professional development. And they're kind of broken down into 4 blocks. And I talked to staff about how the professional development program they're undertaking this year includes these mechanisms, not all of them, but includes at least one from each block, which is what the EEF recommends, that to make sure that professional development is effective in improving pupil outcomes. So if a teacher engages with it properly, it should have a direct link on their teaching, on improving their teaching, and the appraisal system is linked to all of that. It's a way of documenting that improvement in their teaching. So that's a quick synopsis of what we did in the autumn term. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of talk you through what actually happened for the autumn term, and then some areas for development that have emerged from it, and then also give you an overview of what we're doing in the spring term. So in terms of the autumn term, key developments, there were 4 CPD training sessions on a Monday afternoon led by myself to the entire teaching body. One was an introduction to the programme, to CPD for the year and the appraisal system. One session I recapped the routines from the previous year. A further session where I introduced new routines for deliberate instruction and deliberate practice. And then one session that we did immediately after the Christmas holidays, where we analysed and reflected on how well we'd embedded those routines in the autumn term and how we were going to keep working on them, even though the actual official training had stopped in the autumn term. Dovetailed amongst those training sessions led by myself were 4 other SPDS sessions. So these are the subject-specific sessions led by subject leaders, again on a Monday afternoon. And these all in the autumn term all had directions by myself to ensure that part of the discussion that afternoon was reflecting on the routines and how they were going to be embedded in each specific subject area. So how were PE going to ensure that they set up group work and pair work effectively? How were practical subjects like DT going to ensure that? And how were theory subjects like maths and science and English going to ensure that they embedded these routines as best possible in their subject area? And to really problem solve. If there were problems in embedding them, they needed to kind of come up with solutions. Alongside the Monday afternoon teaching and learning sessions, we talked about the fact that subject leader training is also happening, and it's a big part of the professional growth. Now, the Tuesday afternoons is when subject leaders meet, and the training is led by me. So every other Tuesday, they would have some face-to-face training, and all the Tuesday afternoon training sessions in the autumn term were all focused on embedding the ROBRA lesson routine. So I would do some work with the subject leaders of how to lead their SPDSs on a Monday to ensure that these routines were at the forefront of everybody's mind to make sure they were being embedded. So alongside the actual training, some other things that happened as well, just to make you aware. To evaluate the impact of the training, we did 2 departmental learning walks, 2 rounds of these departmental learning walks observations. One happened in December. We did 2 weeks in December, followed by 2 further weeks in January. We introduced a coaching style feed forward as a method that followed learning walks. So subject leaders would watch one of their subject colleagues in a lesson, and then they would sit down with them and have a coaching conversation about what they've seen and give them some feed forward points of how to improve for the future rather than look back and critiquing what's already happened. To get subject leaders comfortable with this style, I did a series of joint learning walks with all the subject leaders. I managed to do one with all the subject leaders in December and modeled this new coaching style, and also made sure, like, I moderated their judgments to make sure that they were picking up the same things as me when we were watching routines. And I think the subject leaders were really appreciative of those. I then also asked the SLT links to do a learning walk with all their subject leads as part of their link meetings every week. We also developed a really effective and accurate mechanism for collating all the feed forward so that it could be shared with myself, with subject leads, with the teacher in question and SLT. And all staff set their first pedagogical growth target based on behaviour, and they reviewed it in January. So those were kind of the key developments in the autumn term in terms of the CPD. Things that we learnt from the autumn term, I focused on learning walks and coaching conversations. I felt that the December learning walks were far more powerful than the January ones. The December learning walks happened during study leave for year 11, so subject leaders had a bit more flex on their timetable to actually go out and watch people and have those coaching conversations. That wasn't there in Jan, and so subject leaders really, some of them didn't complete them, some of them didn't do the coaching conversations, so there was a bit a bit of disconnect there. That shows to me that we need to do a bit more work with our subject leaders in making sure that they understand that their primary goal as a leader of their subject is to grow the grown-ups in their subject. It's not to do the photocopying or organize bits and pieces. It's to actually improve the quality of teaching and learning within their subject. That's what their primary goal is. Coaching conversations that we introduced in the December and that I modeled towards subject leaders still require some work. Some subject leads still revert to just telling their subject colleagues what to do, which isn't best practice. Really need to kind of keep modeling those coaching conversations so that you do it through questioning, so that the colleague being coached gets to that conclusion that you want them to get to, but by doing it by themselves rather than you just telling them. And then finally, having looked at the records of the coaching conversations and the learning walks, it's really highlighted the fact that by January, we still haven't really embedded all the learning lesson routines, and that even though the official training on that has ended, it is still going to need to be kept live throughout the course of the year, and that's a challenge that we're going to need to overcome. In terms of the appraisal system, so if we look at the pedagogical growth target on behaviour for learning that I set everybody, I asked, even though all staff were given one target, I asked them to kind of look at the actions for that target and to think, okay, how would I embed it in my lessons? Some of these the quality of these were quite varied, as were the quality of the reflections on how well they felt that they'd embedded that target. By January, the quality of reflections was quite mixed. So a lot more work needs to be done in terms of getting staff to understand the appraisal process and what we're looking for in it, which is not a tick box exercise. I really want them to develop as reflective practitioners. Same goes for professional growth targets. The targets themselves weren't great, and that probably has highlighted to me that we need to do a bit more work with middle leaders and senior leaders in the school on how to set a really good professional growth target. And again, the reflection points for these were mixed quality for the same reasons. So that's a little summary of the autumn term. If we go on to the spring term now, so like I said earlier, the autumn term focused on behaviour for learning. The spring term was all about responsive teaching. We're moving on and looking at our second school focus in our development plan, which is improving the quality of formative assessment in the school and also long-term summative assessment. This CPD programme was devised in a very different way to the one in the autumn term. This time we decided that we were going to do responsive teaching through routes, and so staff would be able to choose which aspect of responsive teaching they wanted to focus on. So did they want to focus on the planning of responsive teaching in lessons, its execution or how you carry it out, or its interpretation? What do you do with the information once you've carried out some assessments how do you then feed that back to students and get them to improve, either with your guidance and by themselves. So that's a little summary of the 3 routes that we put together. Each of these routes would be led by a route lead or a couple of route leaders that would be part of the new teaching and learning team. And these would also act as coaches for the members of staff that had selected to undertake each route. Now, to make sure that we had an equal distribution of people on each route, and within each subject, there were people that were doing each route. So when they came together to share their practice, they would get something from each of the different aspects of responsive teaching. I introduced a faculty setup. So I clumped together some of the smaller departments and said, right, for the purpose of this CPD, I want you to work in faculties so that you each go off and do your individual training, but a couple of times every half term, you'd come back and share what you'd learned on your training so that nobody gets disadvantaged from only being on one route and they get the input from all the different routes. So that's just a little summary of the faculty setup. Going back to appraisal, this second strand of teaching and learning CPD obviously comes with a second pedagogical growth target, and this one is all about responsive teaching. Again, this is quite different to the behaviour for learning one in that I'm asking staff to select 2 sample classes that they can monitor the impact of their training on. Not to say we're not asking staff to use these as guinea pigs, so they'd only do responsive teaching on these classes and forget about the others. These are just sample classes, one at Key Stage 4, one at Key Stage 3, so they can just track their journey on this training through the impact it's having on these sample classes. So if I just go through some of the key developments very quickly of the spring term. Now, obviously, we're still midway through the spring term, so some of these haven't happened, but this is an overview of what we have planned. So obviously, I've already said about the fact that we've created a brand new teaching and learning coaching team, and they are wonderful. We created them in November. There are 8 exceptional colleagues that have joined. 3 receive a TLR for this historically, and it's part of their leadership roles in the school. But the other 5 have just joined out of the love for wanting to improve teaching and learning in the school, which is wonderful. So they're from a range of subjects and they're all brilliant. We've got together about 4 times now and jointly planned the responsive teaching CPD program together, which has been wonderful. They've also undertaken some training with Michelle Miller. I booked her in for a couple of hours before half term, where she went through the principles of coaching with them to make sure that they knew how to coach and have the coaching conversations. And they will be undertaking all the learning walks as part of this program. So it won't fall on the subject leaders to do it, and that will relieve them for doing other bits. But they will undertake all the learning walks and the coaching conversations and the feed forward on this particular program, and they will each lead one of the routes. So I think at the moment 2 routes have 3 coaches and 1 route has 2 coaches, which is fine. So in terms of what's training has happened this term, we've planned in 5 CPD sessions on a Monday afternoon, specifically on responsive teaching. 2 have been delivered by me. Right at the beginning, just in terms of making sure everybody's on a level playing field and they understand what responsive teaching is all about and what formative assessment is all about. 2 were delivered by the teaching and learning coaching team. 1 was a taught session where they went through some material and some specific strategies. 1 is a review of that taught session, so that's going to be the pattern. And then 1 is led by the teaching body themselves. This is an opportunity for faculty members to get together and share what they've learned in each of their routes. Some other developments then, going into the summer term, we will adopt a similar model that we've adopted this term for delivering 2 further taught sessions on each of the routes, and they will also be followed up by a series of learning walks and coaching conversations. And obviously, we talked about the fact that teaching staff are now working on their second pedagogical growth target on responsive teaching. Subject leader training that's happening on a Tuesday is mirroring to some extent what's happening on a Monday, like it did in the autumn term, but not so much. But the key focus is for subject leader training in terms of teaching and learning is we've asked subject leaders to evaluate the quality of responsive teaching in their departments, particularly for making sure that the correct people are in the correct route, and then thinking about how they can contribute and develop responsive teaching in the department. But also, because the route leaders and the coaches are doing all the learning walks for this CPD program, it frees the subject leaders up to do some really focused work on the lesson routines to make sure that aspect of teaching and learning hasn't died down, and to make sure it's been kept alive throughout the course of the year. So that's just a very brief summary of what we've been doing this year and what we're going to be doing in the summer term. Obviously, I'm very happy to answer any questions on Monday the 18th and share with you some more detailed plans of what the CPD programme looks like if you would like to see that. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on the 18th of March.